Woman, an in-depth exploration of the world of women today with Samantha Dean.
Good evening. It's estimated that child abuse is one of the leading killers of young children today. Tonight our topic is the battered child. We're going to discuss this subject with our guests, Miss Ellen Thompson and Dr. Theodore Putnam. They are the co-authors of a book, Child Abuse, A Community Challenge. They are also both members of a task force on child abuse in Buffalo, New York. Ms. Thompson is a social worker and former director of the Child Abuse Project for the Children's Aid Society, and Dr. Theodore Putnam is a pediatrician in private practice. Dr. Putnam, as a pediatrician, when you think in terms of child abuse, what comes to mind? I mean, what falls into this category?
It's difficult to lump all different types of maltreatment into one statement or one coin phrase, battered child or child abuse. There are many different types of maltreatment of children, and these include physical abuse of a minor or major nature, emotional abuse or maltreatment, or battering, which is sometimes a little bit more difficult on the child, and also neglect, so that you have a number of different types of abuse that are all sort of lumped together when you speak of them.
Now, of these types, which is the most common?
I suppose statistically you would have to say the physical type, because it's very difficult to define what emotional abuse or battering is and what neglect is, because different cultures have different ideas of what that is or what it isn't.
In our culture, what would the criteria be for neglect or for emotional abuse, say?
For emotional abuse, I would suppose you would pick a normal upbringing situation in a family, and anything that is outside that or coning in on one child or a number of children to psychologically abuse them, to make them feel inferior or what have you, would be a form of emotional abuse. From a neglect standpoint, it's a different story. It's just complete and utter leaving alone of a child, perhaps not feeding or dressing or keeping the child warm so that they become malnourished, etc.
Mm-hmm. Well, in reference to the battered child, now where would you draw the line between disciplining a child corporally and battering a child?
Very fine line.
And actually, I think that's one of the difficulties. In fact, one of the studies done on child abuse by a Dr. Gill, he did a nationwide study, he really made the point that until we say corporal punishment is outlawed, we will always have child abuse. That certainly if society says it's all right to hit a child, spare the rod and spoil a child, or something of this sort, then, you know, when do you say it's gone too far? And how can a parent know when he can control himself or not? That it's much easier to step over and harm a child, even if your intent was just discipline.
Mm-hmm. Would you find that the one carries over very often into the other? I was going to actually ask you what type of parent most commonly abuses their child. I mean, is it the psychotic parent, the sadistic, emotionally detached sort of parent, or is it the so-called normal parent who just simply can't handle his or her anger?
I think we'd all feel much better if it really were the psychotic, sadistic person. Because it's kind of frightening to think that any one of us who might be a parent actually could abuse our child. And yet, from the kinds of studies that have been done and from our experiences, it really is true that given the right set of circumstances, anyone could end up abusing their child. So that you get a picture of parents that pretty much runs the gamut. You have some parents who, yes, are mentally ill and could be hospitalized in a mental hospital. And at the other end, you have parents who very much present as respectable people, you know, a two-parent family living in a fair neighborhood, having a clean house, taking good care of their children in every other way, but ending up abusing their children.
So virtually there, but for the grace of God, go a goodly number of parents. If you look into the background of parents who abuse their children, is there a pattern of abuse there too? Is it a self-perpetuating cycle?
It can be. Unfortunately, with abuse, we don't have a lot in the way of longitudinal studies of following, say, an abused child from the time of the incident right on through adulthood. But from what has been done, it's pretty clear that unless there's some kind of intervention and some kind of help given along the line, that child may very well become a battering parent. Because one of the things that's lacking in a parent who ends up abusing their child is a feeling of self-worth and being a good person that people care about, really feeling loved, I guess. And because this is lacking, they end up having a lot more feelings that end up often in abuse.
Dr. Putnam, if somebody brings a child into your office which you suspect is a case of battery or just emotional abuse or neglect or whatever, but you don't know, it's got the indications, but the parent says otherwise, what do?
The best thing to do is to effect a separation of child and parent, and from my standpoint, the best way to do that is to put the child in a hospital. And this way you can investigate any problem that you think may exist, both from an emotional and a physical standpoint, do the proper tests either way, and by hospitalization you effect the separation. And if you do suspect that there is an ongoing condition of abuse or perhaps one incident of abuse, then it's requirement by law that this be reported to the proper authority.
Now, how long-term is this separation? After hospitalization is completed, the injuries are repaired, so to speak?
Well, I think that depends on what you find in considering the evidence that you have from the hospitalization. A lot depends on how severe the abuse is. I think that the national statistic is somewhere around 8 months, but that encompasses periods of a day to 2 days only in hospital to permanent separation from parents into foster care and perhaps adoption later on. So there's a great wide area. Usually, though, I don't know what the statistic is here in this area, but I believe the more widely circulated national statistic is about 8 months.
You say it's the law for pediatricians to report this, but now if a patient comes to you and says, I have brutalized or battered my child, aren't you then somehow breaking a patient-doctor bond?
The physician-patient relationship or privileged communication does not hold in a case of child abuse. Nor does the lawyer-client relationship supposedly hold. You are exempt from that, and you are required by law to report this. It really isn't felt to be a violation of this.
And this is carried out. Pediatricians go along with this. They report them?
Well, yes. That's a point of contention, I suppose, because it's felt generally that the practicing pediatrician, the private pediatrician, does not report as many cases as he sees. And this may be for a number of reasons, that he has the time involved, the problems involved with reporting somebody and perhaps having the evidence show it wasn't a battering, and then he is guilty of, at least morally himself, of doing a wrong thing to the family. And time in court, and nobody likes to get on the stand. The doctors are really a little bit afraid of lawyers, I have to say, and so that you don't find doctors many times reporting a suspected case or even some blatant cases. They feel that they may be able to handle it themselves.
Imagine it must be very difficult to have any real indication of how widespread a problem this is, because it must be difficult to amass statistics, since parents obviously have a tremendous guilt problem here and would lie and everything. But how widespread, in your opinion, do you think it is?
Well, certainly I don't think child abuse is the most extensive problem affecting children today. We certainly pay a lot of attention to it, and rightly so, because it can be very serious. When you think of an infant with a fractured skull and possible permanent brain damage or something like that, obviously that's a very serious problem for that child. But say, as far as percentage of population, it would be a very small percentage of the population that actually gets abused.
Well, when was the last case that you had in your office, Doctor?
About 3 months ago.
3 months ago. And how frequently do you see these cases?
Well, I would say that, well, I've been in private practice for 3 years now, and I've seen 2 cases in private practice. I saw a great many more when I was at the hospital, but these are 2 cases that were fairly well documented. And so for an ordinary practicing pediatrician, you don't see it that often, but it certainly is evident when you do see it. Anything else?
Reporting laws are really pretty specific. All of the states have them, and they're kind of similar, although each state has its own. And a lot of people are required to report. It's not just the doctor. School teachers, social workers, some even put in anyone who has knowledge is required to report a case of suspected abuse. But one of the things I think we need to keep in mind about the reporting is the intent of the reporting. And as an example, in New York State, the reporting law is part of social welfare law. It's not part of the penal code. And I think, you know, it's important for us to know this because the intent is to help the family, to rehabilitate wherever possible. The intent is not to prosecute a parent, to put him in jail, because that doesn't really solve the problem. If we could have more in the way of public education to get across the intent of reporting, perhaps parents themselves who have some of these feelings, or, well, parents know sometimes when they really are on the verge of clobbering a child, they might be a bit more able to get help if they look at it that it's not a criminal act and we're not going to try to put you in jail.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the common feeling is that it is criminal. And in fact, many people feel it ought to be, as long as it's the other person who's done it.
But very often child abuse is symptomatic, isn't it? It's just a manifestation of an inner condition,
Right.
which
Mhm.
should be treated. The child is there, so it gets clobbered. But if the child weren't there, the object would be somebody else or something else,
Mhm.
the object of venom and wrath. I'm interested from a sociological point of view. Do you find that men abuse children any more, any less when they're at home, when the wife is the breadwinner, with any greater degree of frequency, for instance?
Statistics that we do have show pretty much, you know, even kinds of things between father and mother. One of the things about abuse, especially the serious kind, however, is that you rarely know what really happens, because there's almost never an admission by the parent, except maybe years later. The abuse is documented by medical evidence, really, so that no one comes in and says, I did it. And it's often just you kind of guess which parent may have done it. But it seems to be pretty well divided.
It's fairly evenly divided, although you'll find that Ellen and I may differ in a few points because I read the medical literature and she reads the social literature. But from what I gather from the literature that I read, the father is the more abusing parent in overall numbers of cases, but in the more serious cases, it's by and large the mother.
Why do you think this is so?
I really don't know. I think that's something for the psychologist to work out, but this is rather clear in the statistics, at least of medically reported cases, that the father is the more, at least if he abuses, he doesn't abuse as badly as the mother does.
Have you personally seen abuse cases where it has been the father who has been instrumental?
Oh, yes. You know, and mother also. The only fatalities that I've been involved with, which were 4, were all mother.
Mm.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Yes. How about boys versus girls? Do girls, suffer more, or do boys suffer more, or is it more or less even?
That's pretty much 50-50, right?
Uh-huh.
So sometimes it's the sex of the child that maybe causes the abuse, but, you know, in a broad range of population, that comes out to be pretty even.
And is it confined to any socioeconomic strata of society, or is it diversified?
I think it depends what study you do and where the reporting comes from. That's, of course, the problem in all of this. When we talk about abuse, we're really talking about cases that get reported. So then you have to look at where are the ones that aren't being reported, or are there any? It's true that the poor tend to have to use, clinics, public hospitals, and so on. They don't have the private pediatrician, so they're much more visible, so that reporting could be weighted that way. Actually, studies have shown contrasting things. Some have shown predominantly poverty areas, and others have shown more or less middle class. I would say most studies pretty much show that it's not upper middle class America that's abusing their child, or certainly not what's getting reported.
I think this is what Gil pointed out, and it's the fact that perhaps the private pediatrician is being maligned by being indicted for not reporting as many cases as he sees. Nobody doubts that he does.
Who pointed out, sorry?
Well, that if we talk about higher socioeconomic versus low, most people who have a private pediatrician would be on a higher socioeconomic scale, and that it would show from the statistics that fewer of these people have been reported as abused children. Is this because fewer of them are abused or because fewer pediatricians report them? Gill feels from his study that perhaps poverty is at fault in one of the etiologic agents leading toward battering. In other words, there are many more tensions, crises that occur in a family where there's less to eat, there's no heat, there's no water, than there are in families that are fairly well situated. And so perhaps battering may be a disease of poverty. He doesn't say that it is specifically, but there's good indication.
What are some of the other causes other than poverty? Do you find that a child who is not wanted in the first place is perhaps more vulnerable? Do you find that marital difficulties aggravate the situation? Or does it have nothing to do with any of this?
Actually, all of those things could play a role in the abuse. And I think one of the things that's pointed out in some of the literature by Drs. Helfer and Kemp is that there needs to be this combination of a certain kind of parent and a specific child, and then really a crisis incident. The parent, and now we're talking really about the more classical battering of an infant or a young child, not something that comes out of discipline. But the parent has probably had this background of no parenting or feeling loved or wanted himself. And very often people have babies sort of expecting the baby to love them. And then you have a specific child. Well, if that child happens to be kind of a normal, pretty healthy, responsive child, things go along fairly well. But if, for example, all of a sudden this very nice baby, is spitting up and not eating, and that adds something. That's a source of irritation. And then you have a particular crisis situation, and maybe that week, there wasn't as much money come home, or the husband and wife had a quarrel, or there was a death in the family. Something out there happened which led to more pressure, more tension. Well, kind of the combination of those three things come together, and the parent ends up battering that child. It doesn't mean he doesn't love the parent either, because that's how these kids get to the hospital. The parent does care, and they want medical help.
Right. Sometimes you see in the newspapers these absolutely terrifying pictures of children who've been brutalized. Do you think this is over-sensationalized, or do you think this should happen? This should be the case?
I think it's over-sensationalized, really.
I'd agree. I think it's that's just the other end of the scale that happens this way. There are certain children who are brutalized terribly. But as Ellen has pointed out, the great majority of children that are battered or neglected or maltreated or whatever you want to call it have a very minor sort of injury from a physical standpoint. What happens from a mental standpoint is a different story altogether, but most things don't occur in these sensationalized ways.
And if we do sensationalize it, I think what happens is that it makes a parent even more reluctant to admit having some feelings about their child, because they don't want to be put in the category of that terrible parent who burned their child so terribly that there were pictures all over the newspaper. And actually, there can be help before the serious battering occurs, but it takes a certain amount of strength on the part of the parent in recognizing that really I'm going to lose control, or I have some pretty strong feelings against this child. And if society were more accepting of these feelings, or more openly admitting them, because I think we all know they're there, I think there'd be a lot more chance of a parent getting help before it happened. That's sort of what the group's, Parents Anonymous would be based on. A parent who is willing to say, I know I have a problem, and I want some help before I go ahead and batter.
Now, Parents Anonymous is run presumably on the lines of Alcoholics Anonymous, judging by the name. It's a self-help concept, isn't it?
Right.
How effective do you think an organization like this is? I mean, it's got a hotline, doesn't it, that you can pick up any time of the day and call. Do you feel that parents on the brink of abusing their child will use that hotline?
I think some will. But again, this depends on the kind of work that's been done ahead of time. If you just sort of advertised in the paper, if you feel like abusing your child, come to this group meeting, I don't think you'd get too many coming. But if a community would really sort of set up a public education kind of thing, letting parents know that these are pretty natural feelings, and then channeling that into some discussion and self-help kinds of groups, I think you'd probably get a fairly good response.
What other organizations are there that a parent might have recourse to in this type of situation? Do you know any, Doctor?
Well, there, I suppose if a parent felt as if he or she were going to batter their child, they could call the child welfare department or, excuse me, their church or what have you. I don't think that this is the type of institution they would call because it's too personalized for them.
Well, when you see a parent with a child who's been brutalized in some way, do you give any counseling to the parents, or do you refer them for counseling? Or do they usually ask for it? Are they interested in it at that point?
They don't usually ask for it because they don't usually admit it.
Well, the cases that do admit it.
The ones that do admit it usually are referred through the courts for counseling. However, in some areas of the country, there is no facility for this. It's very easy for a law to be passed saying that these people have to be followed for a certain length of time and all that, but you have to have the money and the physical
staff,
plant, the staff, and the record keeping. It's just phenomenal.
So ideally, there should be a Parents Anonymous in every city in the United States. It
I
would
think it's a good idea.
certainly be a step in the right direction. Do you feel ever that parents sort of masochistically bring on a situation which will involve them in a confrontation with a child, you know, as just a deliberate outlet?
Gee, that's an awful lot of psychodynamics. I don't think so. No, I think it's many times it's a frustration situation where it's a spur of the moment type. I don't know how many of these maltreatment or batterings are planned.
No, very few, I think, really.
I think.
I think maybe just to spell out a little more what kinds of things can happen to children. The battered baby that we talked about with this, you know, the serious injury is one certain kind of entity. But then there are children who receive really chronic bruises, nothing that ends up getting them in the hospital or would be that serious that even they maybe get to a doctor.
Statistically,
It's often
the most frequent instrument is the hairbrush.
Really?
Yeah.
And, you know, schools tend to see this, but the chronic bruising over a period of time really shows that something else is operating, that this child is sort of an outcast in the family, and you know, maybe that's the child who, when the rest of the kids are downstairs watching TV, they're up in their own bedroom just sort of sitting there, or they're the child who doesn't eat right, or something else is going on with them.
Is one child in a family usually singled out to be the object of abuse and assault? Or if there's a large family, is it usually meted out evenly?
No, again, that depends on the kind of abuse. If the abuse results from discipline, for example, if parents believe, and many do, you know, that it's right to hit kids with a belt or some other object when they misbehave, then all of the children can be abused because kids are going to, you know, not do what they're supposed to do. But if it's the other kind of battering or chronic bruising, it's more often singled unto one child.
What about the personality of the child himself or herself? I've read rather of a case, and I'm just wondering if it's typical, of a child who obviously elicited this type of response from his parents because the reaction of his parents to the child was so extreme that the child had to be separated, was then sent to foster parents, and the foster parents brutalized this child. So this gives rise to the impression that there must have been something within this personality of this child that called this forth. Do you think this happens frequently?
I wouldn't know how often, but certainly it is true that children who are separated from their parents and because of abuse often demonstrate the same kind of behavior, which is really inviting abuse. And unless you have some pretty special parents and the professional help for the foster parents, it may very well happen the child will be abused again.
It's a peculiar thing. Everybody talks about the personality, the abused child personality, but nobody has ever been able to really pin it down. Is it one particular type of child, or is it certain, did they run the gamut again, or is it a hyperactive child, as you say? Nobody's been able to really bring it into a well-focused sort of plane so that you can pinpoint these children beforehand, saying this is a child who would be typically abused. Can we prevent his parents from doing it or her parents from doing it? But nobody can bring this into us yet. I don't know why. Perhaps the study isn't full enough or what have you. I want to bring up one point that it isn't always the parent who abuses also. There are sitters and there are also siblings.
Yes, yes.
We have in the medical literature case reports of I think 4 or 5 deaths caused by sisters or brothers or cousins. from ages 4 to 8 would cause the death of their small baby sister or brother.
Wow. How about the personality, as you were talking, of the child, the psychology of the child? Do you think this child will be affected psychologically, irrevocably for the rest of his life by being brutalized in this way? Do you think this child will ever learn to trust again? Is there any hope, in other words, for the battered child?
Certainly there is hope, and we have seen this in situations where children have been removed because of serious abuse and lived in foster care for a couple of years. Parents, meanwhile, admitted to some problems and got some help themselves, in a way learned to get along with the child, sort of renewed acquaintances with the child on a better plane, and the child has been able to go back home.
Mm-hmm.
And so there certainly is hope, and the important thing is early intervention of a helpful kind.
We've got 2 minutes left, and in this 2 minutes I'd like you both to tell me what you feel is wrong with the system as it exists today on this subject. I'm sure you could talk for half an hour. You've got 2 minutes, unfortunately.
Right.
Should have the first minute.
Okay. One of the things is that there are several disciplines involved in handling child abuse. Obviously the medical, the social work, and the legal profession. And there often are tendencies for each one to feel that they have the expertise and they are the ones to completely handle abuse. So that in communities you might find some real disagreements as to how cases should be handled and who should report, and kind of saying they don't know what they're doing or whatever. And what we've learned is that these three disciplines have to work together. And that one of the things communities have to do, you can pass all the laws you want, but you have to get together and decide in your community, how are we going to handle child abuse? And it involves the three professions working together as a team, and that's really essential.
I think that's the main point that almost everybody brings out, and certainly has worked in places like Denver and Boston, where you have a community program ongoing, but it nevertheless is all funneled into one group of expert people who deal with this day in and day out, who know how to approach parents, take care of the child, direct therapy for the parents and for the child, and follow up on this. The important part being the follow-up. It's an ongoing sort of program.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, the 2 minutes is up. Thank you both, Dr. Putnam, Miss Ellen Thompson. We'll be back again next week. Good night from Woman.